Hi everyone, and I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about AI and PPE, personal protective equipment. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Kate Field and I am the Global Head of Human and Social Sustainability at BSI. So today I'd like to explore a question that I believe will become increasingly important over the coming years. What happens when PPE starts to making decisions? So for over a century, personal protective equipment has occupied a very clear place within occupational health and safety. PPE has traditionally been our final line of defence, sitting at the bottom of the hierarchy of controls. It's been designed to protect workers when hazards can't be eliminated, substituted, engineered out, or adequately controlled through other administrative measures. But advances in sensors, connectivity, and artificial intelligence are beginning to challenge some of those assumptions. But before we get into AI, I think it's worth recognizing that a lot of this technology and PPE and that connectivity is not new. For instance, many organizations have been using GPS-enabled lone worker devices for years, decades even. Gas detection systems that continuously monitor environments are already out there and alert workers to danger. Man down alarms, refit tracking, and connected wearables have all been part of the safety landscape for some time. So this is not the start of a new journey. Rather, it's the next stage, an evolution that's already underway. The difference is that historically, technology has largely been used to alert and collect data and provide communication. The difference, I think, with AI is increasingly they are being used to interpret that information, identify patterns, and I think the key thing is around generating predictions. And that distinction is really important. So I often think about PP evolution in these three stages. So we had the first generation, which was focused on protection, your traditional hard hats, gloves, eye protection, and breathing apparatus were designed to provide fundamentally a physical barrier between the worker and the hazard. The second generation introduced detection and connectivity, so sensors, monitoring systems, and connected devices allowed organisations to gather data and respond more quickly to changing situations. And this third generation that we're starting to see emerge focuses on prediction and decision support. Systems are increasingly able to identify fatigue, predict heat stress, recognise hazards, and provide potentially real-time recommendations before an incident even happens. So in other words, PPE is evolving from protection to detection to prediction. And I suppose just a little shout out here that we shouldn't forget that wearable robotics also fall into the classification of PPE, as it's personal, it's equipment, and it's protecting against physical harm. So when we're talking about PPE, it does include wearable robotics. People often forget that, so I thought I'd just highlight it. And I think that kind of brings us to what is the most interesting question when we start to think about this PPE 3.0, the AI element of PPE. What happens when the PPE knows something before the worker or the employer does? So let's consider fatigue. Traditionally, a worker begins to feel tired. Maybe their concentration starts to drop. A supervisor may notice changes in behaviour or performance, particularly if that fatigue is kind of extended over a period of time. And eventually, ideally, possibly, an intervention may occur, but that's usually after weeks or months of decreasing performance and increasing fatigue. In an AI-enabled environment, a wearable device may identify indicators of fatigue before the worker consciously recognises them, and it might generate alerts automatically to the worker and to the supervisor. And then there might be decisions that are triggered off of that. And at first glance, it sounds like an improvement, doesn't it? Faster recognition, faster intervention, less likely to cause harm or problems. But I wonder if it is. Because I think it starts to raise a number of really important questions. I call these the so what questions. So I've been to a number of sandboxes recently where some of this tech has been demonstrated. And, you know, on first glance, it looks amazing. It looks all whizzy and clever and it's giving all this data. But when you've got to ask the question, so what? So you got this data, you get an alert, somebody's fatigued, so what? So what happens if the worker disagrees, actually doesn't feel tired, feels perfectly happy to continue, but the AI system is correct in terms of the markers that it's tracking? But what if the AI system has got it wrong? You know, one of the things with wearables and these tracking devices is they're not perfect. You know, various things might give them incorrect data. AI hallucinates, we know that. So what if it's the AI that's got it wrong? What if there is genuinely a concern about fatigue, but in that moment the worker is actually a doctor who's carrying out life performing surgery? What if it's in the utilities sector and there's been a huge storm and the power out is out across half the country? You know, people, it's essential to get that power back up. You know, you're protecting vulnerable communities, and therefore, you know, there may be fatigue, but it might not be appropriate to stop the work. So there's all these so what questions. And I think another one, particularly when we're looking at fatigue and potentially thinking about that kind of overtime situation, you know, a lot of workers rely on overtime, that extra money it brings in, to make ends meet. Is it appropriate to deny them that opportunity, particularly if your whole pay structure is kind of built it in, which in a lot of organisations and businesses, that happens. And another question, what is the fatigue range? So what if it's a range and 1 is exhausted and definitely shouldn't be working, and 10 is absolutely optimal? And, you know, if you're below a 3, you're unfit to work, and above 8, it's like optimal. And kind of sufficient is between a 4 and 7. What happens if there's an accident and the worker was at 4? Just think about that for a minute. Not optimal, just above the cut-off of not being in work. It poses some really interesting questions that people aren't thinking about. And of course, you know, we've got the question of who ultimately decides if a worker is fit to continue. Is it the worker? Is it the supervisor? Or is it the algorithm? You know, when and how is that decision being made? And that decision will need to be recorded. And that's more data. And we're going to come back to data shortly. Another one that I'm seeing kind of being tested a lot is around psychological health and safety. And if I'm worried, this one, if I'm honest, this one worries me even more. So some of the technology being used is using smartphone camera to detect microscopic, invisible to the eye changes in facial skin color and blood flow, and translating those patterns into heart rate variability, and as a result of that, stress levels. Okay, right. So it's spotted stress. Is it good stress or is it bad stress? We know that both exist. We know that actually being exposed to some good stress is good for us. Of course, too much bad stress is bad for us. But can the system detect the difference between the two? I think some of the biggest concerns around this sort of technology using cameras is that they are not effective across different types of skin colour. And I think that's really important. If it's monitoring kind of basically blood flow, what happens if somebody's just had caffeine or spicy food, if they're menstruating or it's a menopause, or medications? All of those things can actually change blood flow and our heart rate variability. How is that taken into account? And I'm always curious that we know that, workers want to do the right thing, but if the system isn't working for them, they'll find ways around the system. So one of the questions I asked when I saw this tech being showcased, I said, well, what happens if the worker splashes cold water in their face before they take the photo? Will that change the outcome? And of course it will. And of course, that question when we're thinking about bad stress, psychological health and safety in the workplace, we know that actually it's the accumulation, the cumulative effect of bad stress that starts to become an issue. So how is the system measuring for that? And of course, the other thing is that, our individual stress tolerance changes at different points of our lives. We might have different levels of stress when we're parents, especially new parents, when we're going through the menopause, when we've had a promotion, when it's the end of year reviews. How is all of that factored in? And I think this is the point that I like to, as I often do, call on some film references. And I think when we're talking about kind of technology and AI in particular and all the exciting things it might be able to do, and I think some of those are exciting, but I do think we need to have a little bit of caution here. And I like to refer to the quote from Jurassic Park. So Dr. Ian Malcolm says this quote: "Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think whether they should." And I think that's the key when we're looking at this technology. There's so much excitement, and I say I've been to these sandboxes, I've seen the people behind the technology, they get super excited. They have no real understanding about real world application and what it's going to mean in the workplace. So it's up to us as health and safety professionals to be really on this. It really is. We are going to be kind of at literally the first line of defense in terms of really interrogating this technology in terms of actually, is it adding value or is it just creating complexity? So that question, when technology is being looked at, whether it's smart PPE or other forms of sort of particularly AI driven technology from a health and safety point of view, stop. We've got to stop and actually think about whether this is adding value. And the reason for that is that, these questions matter because AI isn't simply providing information. It's creating knowledge, and knowledge changes accountability. If an organisation receives an alert indicating elevated fatigue risk, does that create an obligation to intervene? What if the alert is ignored? What if an incident occurs later? What if at that example I gave earlier, what if an incident occurs when technically they were a 4, which is technically okay, but they weren't optimal, they weren't an 8 or a 9? Equally, what happens when the technology produces false positives or false negatives? We know with things like fire alarms that, false positives lead to frustration and people start to ignore the technology, and unnecessary interventions, reduce trust in the system. False negatives, of course, then might create a false sense of security. The technology itself may be impressive, but actually it's the governance challenges that I think are arguably much, much, much more significant. And this brings us to the issue of data. So many AI-enabled PPE solutions will collect information that goes far beyond any traditional safety metrics. So depending on the technology involved, systems may collect heart rate data, body temperature, movement patterns, fatigue indicators, as well as, perhaps more traditional information like location information. They may also start to collect behavioural data. And of course, some of this information will have implications under data protection legislation. And some of this will be considered health-related information. And that adds another layer of complexity. If it's occupational health, then actually you've got to be able to record and store that data for, depending on the legislation in your part of the world, but maybe for up to 40 years, as well as kind of what other parts of regulation might be in place about what data you're collecting and storing under data protection legislation. Some of this information may reveal really sensitive insights about individuals that extend beyond workplace health and safety. So this raises really important questions. Who owns the data? Who can access it? How long should it be retained? Can it be used solely for health and safety performance or purposes? Or could it eventually be used for more general performance management, attendance management, or disciplinary action? And of course, if this data exists, if there is an incident, then that information will be available to your insurance provider, but also the regulators. And what about security? So we've now suddenly got hundreds, maybe thousands of bits of connected PPE. And that means that's hundreds or thousands more points where bad actors can potentially gain access to your systems. So, if we're starting to think about using this technology from a health and safety point of view, we've got to understand what the implications are from a data and a cyber information security point of view, because it's potentially increasing the overall risk in all of these areas. These are not purely technical questions. They are questions of governance, ethics, and trust. And that point about trust brings us to another area that I believe deserves much greater attention: psychological health and safety. AI-enabled PPE has the potential to deliver significant benefits: earlier interventions, better support, reduced incidents, more personalised protection. However, poorly implemented systems may also introduce new psychosocial risks. Workers may feel constantly monitored. They may perceive systems as surveillance rather than support. They may lose a sense of autonomy or control. And we know that autonomy is critical to our psychological health and safety. They may become anxious about information and how it's being used. And of course, this starts to come back to kind of one area that I talk about a lot, and that's organizational culture and why it becomes so important. Technology that's designed to improve health and safety can inadvertently undermine that improvement if it damages trust. So the success of AI-enabled PPE may depend less on the technology itself. Actually, it does. It really does. We know this. When you look at any sort of technology that's been introduced, whether it's software, hardware, or, when we're talking about AI, we know a lot of it fails. And it fails because there is not good participation and consultation with workers from the very first moment. And then there isn't the communication or the governance to implement it effectively. So before we get excited about AI, we need to remember that it's still PPE. As exciting as AI may be, the equipment must still perform its primary protective function. Does it still protect against the hazard? Does it still fit properly? Does it remain comfortable to wear? Does it comply with applicable regulatory and standards requirements? A smart helmet that fails as a helmet is a failed helmet. So it's got to do its primary job first. And then, of course, this technology is going to introduce new risks, battery safety, charging risks. This is additional weight, which is likely to have ergonomic impacts. How reliable is it in different environments? What are the implications in terms of cleaning and decontamination? And, a really simple question, if this is some PPE and it's connected and the whole system's kind of relied on these connected devices, what happens when the battery dies? Really simple question. These considerations remind us that innovation should not distract us from the fundamentals of good risk management. At the same time, AI may create opportunities to extend elements of traditional approaches to protection. And I think potentially the personalization is an interesting one. So historically, much PPE has been designed around the concept of an average worker. And we know there's no such thing as an average worker. Workers vary by age, sex, physiology, health status, experience, and circumstance. AI may create opportunities for more personalised approaches to protection and support. I think the other thing that we need to think about, in this context is two workers performing the same task in the same environment may experience different levels of risks. So particularly around something like heat. And technology may help us understand and respond to those differences. So, there are good things here. But technology may help us better understand and respond to those differences, which is great. But let's kind of maybe come back to our hierarchy of controls. I've asked the question, and I certainly heard others ask it, that does AI move PPE from the bottom of the hierarchy of controls towards the top? And I don't think that's right. I think it does start to blur the hierarchy itself. I don't think it's going to be quite as clear as perhaps it has been. If the PPE can detect, predict, communicate, or influence decisions, it becomes more than equipment. It does become part of a wider organizational control system. So I think this is kind of, if you like, the overall upside, if we address all of the downsides, and they are really big questions, and I don't know that we can actually, but if we can, if it becomes part of that wider organizational control system, the real value may not lie in the helmet itself, the wearable or sensor. The real value may lie in what the organization learns and then acts on in terms of that knowledge that has been generated. So a kind of a few reflections. For decades, PPE has protected workers from hazards. AI-enabled PPE has the potential to do something different, to anticipate risks, to influence behaviour, and to generate new knowledge about people and work. The challenge is therefore no longer simply whether the technology works. The challenge is whether organisations can govern it responsibly, use it ethically, and implement it in ways that strengthen trust rather than weaken it. Because ultimately, the future of PPE may not be about equipment at all. It may be about the relationship between technology, people, and trust. So just a signpost to kind of key standards that might be relevant in this space. So when we're thinking about inclusive PPE, our new free standard, BS 30417, is available, and that's a guide to inclusive PPE provision. Of course, ISO 45001, our core health and safety management system, is going to be relevant, and I expect to see that kind of the use of technology will become more prominent in the revision that's going to be coming through over the next few months. When we're thinking about psychological health and safety, ISO 45003 is a standard you need to use. We've got ISO 27001, which is about information security management. So that's part of your data protection systems and what that looks like. We've got ISO 42001, which is AI management, and then complementing that, I think, is actually kind of the really important one, is ISO 45005, which is the AI impact assessment. It's kind of a risk assessment for AI. So you're going to introduce this AI system, you know, what are the risks, what are the opportunities, and what does that look like across the whole business, including from a health and safety point of view. So there's lots of really good guidance to help you explore this area. And we have a range of training on all of these topics, including an introduction to AI, available to you as well. So I hope that you have found that informative. I hope that it raises and gets you thinking about some of these really important questions. And, you know, remember Dr. Malcolm, you know, that actually, whoa, hang on, just because the technology exists, is it really the right and best solution? Thank you.